Specials in Pursuit by Tony Brown. Read by the author. Other books by the author include Jack the Ripper Ate My Hamster, Ethel Martini, International Woman of Mystery, Ethel Martini, Shaken and Stirred, War and Peace, Concise Guide to Married Life, How to Win Friends and Influence People, from the Memoirs of Adolf Hitler, Ethel the Aardvark Goes Quantity Surveying. This audiobook is dedicated to all of my family, past, present and future. Chapter 1. Scene 1, Take 1. Pinewood, down by the quayside. More than a century had now passed since the unresolved Jack the Ripper murders took place in Whitechapel. It was late October. It was midnight. It was dark. Not much chance of this darkness clearing up until morning, mused Burke, as he strolled along the cobbled streets that wound its way down to the river. Burke was a simple enough chap, and what you saw was very much what you got. It could never be said he was as deep as an ocean, or like as deep as a puddle that had almost completely dried out in the midday sun. He was the latest in a long line of special constables the Northumbria police had recently taken on. The desk sergeant, Oscar Wordsworth, had serious misgivings about him right from the start. His concerns were initially aroused on Burke's first day as a volunteer. He arrived at the station wearing a rather ill-fitting uniform, trousers too short, jacket too big, and the peak of his helmet was slightly askew-with. Sergeant Wordsworth had challenged Burke about his appearance, but Burke was quick to explain that the issue of wrong trousers was due to a communication breakdown. When asked how long his legs were, he'd retorted, "They're just long enough to reach the ground." "The next I knew, I'd been issued with these," Burke reminisced. As for the jacket, well... But Sergeant Wordsworth had stopped him at this point, as he didn't have all day to discuss modern-day fashion consciousness with the likes of Special Constable Burke. Instead, after running his finger along a computer printout of recently inaugurated volunteers, he suddenly announced, "Burke! You must be Burke. Nicholas Burke?" "Yes, that's right," said Burke. "But you can call me by my nickname if you like." "What's that?" asked Sergeant Wordsworth, quickly cursing his curiosity. "Nick," beamed Burke. Sergeant Wordsworth sighed. Presently, Burke was making his way down River Road. Whilst proceeding in an orderly fashion, Burke recited to himself, imagining his first time in the box at the Old Bailey, giving evidence against a master criminal who had eluded even the most experienced and highly acclaimed DI. That is, up until the enrolment of the greatest sleuth this country had ever known, namely Burke, postman by day, special constable by night. This, proceeding in an orderly fashion, quickly transformed into more of a slipping and a sliding like a pregnant seal, as Burke trod on something that he recognised as not quite a solid and not quite a liquid. Dog shit. Some canine that Burke could only presume was the size of a Shetland pony emptied the entire contents of its posterior right across the uneven pavement that lay in front of him. As his right foot slid across the pavement, the rest of his body felt an irresistible urge to follow it. Gathering himself up, Burke rubbed the back of his head several times, picked up his helmet from the damp gutter, and carefully inspected it with his nose for any indications of malodorous particles, before placing it back on his head. Then meticulously surveyed the scene around him. "Why is there never any grass around when you need it?" Burke thought to himself, as he began to shuffle his foot back and forth along the pavement, trying to remove the last remains of excrement from his size 12 boot. He soon found himself peering down a steep, cobbled alleyway to the right of where he'd encountered this mutt's gift to the world. As the street lamp from the main road only proffered a modest amount of light in the direction of the dark alley, Burke could barely make out what appeared to be a pile of discarded newspapers, 3 abandoned shopping trolleys, and an old cardboard box. His attention was soon distracted by an unusual noise. It sounded like water spurting out erratically onto the wall, like a burst drain pipe, and Burke realised he'd heard that noise before. Assuming it was that same dumbfounded dog taking a leak against the wall, Burke picked up an empty milk bottle Mrs. Willits had left on the doorstep of number 36 and projected the glass missile in the direction of the noise, shouting, "Take that, you mangy mutt!" The bottle landed squarely on the forehead of a rather inebriated grey-haired old man who was wearing a dirty white, stained raincoat, which came with matching belt, who had until then been relieving himself. The trajectory and force of the throw, such that it, quite aside from ruining his train of thought, propelled the old man over 2 of the shopping trolleys before he landed head first into the 3rd. The trolley, unwilling to remain stationary on the hill, as recently acquired passenger on board, promptly began to roll downwards across the cobbles of the steep, winding alleyway, gathering surprising speed as it went. The old man peeled his face from the bottom of the trolley, and as he turned his head round, he noticed that the belt of his raincoat was caught in between the spindles of the trolley. Trying to free the belt, he began jerking and tugging in all directions, cursing as he went, but making little progress. A groan of discomfort could now be heard emanating from inside the trolley as it rolled along the cobbles. "Ooh! Ow! Ah!" came the cries at various intervals from the caged pensioner, who felt every bump as the trolley made its way down the alley. Almost instinctively, it appeared to have plotted a course to steer its way from all obstacles in its way, trying to slow its progress, and the old man began to feel more and more nauseous as he bumped from side to side within the trolley. With increasing speed, the squeaky wheels carried him further and further down the alley like a runaway train, and unbeknown to him, the trolley was now heading straight towards the narrow steps at the end that led the way down to the riverside. Within moments, the trolley had reached its target. It leapt off the top step, bounced off another, and then went hurtling into the air, missing out the next couple of steps before bouncing again, and spinning like a whirling dervish. With every bounce, the disgruntled victim inside could be heard voicing the most obscene expletives. On reaching the bottom of the steps, the old man had finally finished wrestling with the belt and had managed to free the buckle from between the spindles. He lifted his head up, a look of horror ran across his face as he realised he was heading straight towards the river. Hardly had enough time to blurt out, "Oh shit!" before the trolley careered across the road, narrowly missed a lamppost, and came to an abrupt halt when it ran straight into a concrete bollard on the riverside, erected there for the safety of the public. He was promptly catapulted out of the trolley and plunged feet first into the river. "Did you read the papers today?" inquired Desk Sergeant Oscar Wordsworth as Burke strolled into the station the following evening. "No, there was loads of mail in this morning. By the time I'd finished my delivery, I was well ready for a kip on the sofa." "Well," Oscar started, "it's amazing some of the things they print. There's a story here in the Daily Sport about an old age pensioner. Mind, I can't recollect ever meeting a young age pensioner, can you? Anyway, it says here that the old geezer was admitted to the casualty department of Tynewood General Hospital in the early hours of this morning, suffering from a mild concussion, having received a large bump on his bonce and also several cuts and bruises. Apparently, the old man was rescued from the Tyne by a passerby who seen him flapping about in the water. The passerby himself was nearly pushed into the river whilst trying to pull the guy out, when an over-amorous Labrador called Dave— who on earth would call a dog Dave? Queried Burke. "Who knows," said Oscar, "but that's not important right now. It says it came out from nowhere and tried to mount the poor bloke from the side. It goes on to say here that the old guy, who nurses say stunk of booze, was gibbering on about how he thought a large dog came at him in the alleyway, brandishing a milk bottle, suddenly coshed him over the head with it, forced him at bottle point to get into a shopping trolley, then pushed him at breakneck speed down the alley like someone off supermarket sweep. The next thing he remembers is some guy with a wet nose and 4 legs, 2 of them extremely hairy, pulling him out of the river and panting very heavily. "They call that news," remarked Burke. "Yeah, I know," said Oscar. "Obviously what they call a slow news day. The guy's obviously an alkie who becomes seriously unhinged somewhere along the way. I mean, imagine a dog attacking someone with a milk bottle and running him into the river in a shopping trolley. Talking about animals on the rampage. I know we say it's a jungle out there, but what'll it be next? The owl and the pussycat go out to sea and turn into the bleeding pirates of Penzance. Do you think we should bring the dog in for questioning?" Burke inquired. "See now," said Oscar, pulling out his goatee beard while choosing his words carefully. "We didn't find out much about the dog, so you could say we have no leads." Oscar studied Burke's face for any signs of movement, his eyes for any signs of life. Neither were forthcoming. "You get it? Dog, no leads?" There was still no reaction from Burke. "No, we won't bother," sighed Oscar at length. "I think we'd only be barking up the wrong tree." Whiskey Alpha Romeo Romeo Echo, November. "Are you receiving me over?" asked Sterling Jobsworth, the ever-efficient short-sighted driver. "Of course I am, Sterling," said Warren Uglygate, who looked like Charles Bronson on Smack. "I'm standing right next to you, you dummy. They don't exactly make these urinals very far apart. And for your information, I'd be grateful not to receive any more of you. I mean, do you really have to turn and face me just to talk to me? That'll end. And you can dispense with the use of that phonetic alphabet every time you address me. The name is Warren. 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 Sergeant Wordsworth says I've got to practice. Proper policemen spell out their words pathetically," said Sterling. "You mean phonetically," corrected Warren. "And anyway, you're not a proper policeman, are you? Far from it, in fact. You're just a special, same as me." Just then, Burke walked in. "So this is where the big knobs hang out, is it?" "You better ask him," said Warren. "He's the one acting like a fountain of knowledge at the moment. Next time I go to the bog with him, I'll wear me waders." Down by the riverside, Burke was trying to mimic the posture and confident stride of Ponsonby. He realised that if he was ever to be taken seriously as a policeman, we'd firstly have to develop the policeman's walk. That way of walking shows the world you're an important person. And every now and again, he found himself having to do a half step to synchronise his strides with that of his colleague. This was making Ponsonby more and more agitated as he walked along. Finally, he snapped, "Look, call me particular." "Okay," said Burke, "particular." "Idiot, let me finish," said Ponsonby. "I mean, call me particular, but I'd really prefer it if you didn't do that." "What?" asked Burke. "Keep walking in sync with me. Anyone would think we were joined at the hip." "I wouldn't mind, but it's that bloody skipping you keep doing every time you lose your rhythm. You remind me of Dobie, the scene from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs." "Sorry, just trying to look professional like you. It's just that before becoming a special, I used to watch a lot of the Bill, and there was always that bit at the end, they were walking in sync, always staying in rhythm. You think they could hear the theme tune as they were walking along? I suppose they could have loudspeakers hidden somewhere in the street, so they could hear the beat." Ponsonby treated this with a disdain it deserved, contented himself with the thought that this was just about time to go home, and thus put an end to the night's mental torture. They both strolled up to the top of the embankment, and Ponsonby said, "Good night, Burke. See you tomorrow." Ponsonby had struggled to contain his relief. Just as the night before, Burke found himself again walking down River Road, it being the shortest way home. Curiously enough, it was exactly midnight, and curiouser still, it was dark. Again. As he passed the same back alleyway, where he'd had the encounter with the dog turd and the milk bottle, he noticed that, quite eerily, there was absolutely nothing at all to notice. No one about, no empty milk bottles standing on Mrs. Willett's doorstep. nor was there likely to be again. She'd had a falling out with her milk supplier that very morning. According to eyewitnesses, there'd been a bit of a domestic outside number 36, and Mrs. Willits grabbed Ernie the milk boy warmly by the throat and demanded to know why she hadn't been left a pint of demi-skimmed and a low-fat apricot nugget. Ernie had done his best to pacify her, but she wasn't having any of it. "What am I supposed to give my pussy now?" she cried at the top of her voice, much to the stifled amusement of Ernie, who thought she could have chosen her words more carefully, and having heard a couple of titters and sniggers, realised that a small gathering of neighbours had formed around him. He tried not to look at them, as he knew he'd only start to laugh, and this was a serious matter, after all. Apparently, she said, she'd left a specific order for the said items by means of a carefully worded note, which had been rolled up and neatly inserted into the milk bottle and left on the doorstep the previous evening, just before retiring to bed. Having limply explained that there'd been no note, nor empty milk bottle on the doorstep, Ernie had also been unable to offer a satisfactory explanation as to why anyone should want to go around stealing empty milk bottles late at night. Mrs. Willits had duly informed him that she was now in the process of looking for alternative purveyors of dairy products. As Burke turned the corner of River Road, his night was about to change. All of a sudden, dense fog seemed to rise up from nowhere, rapidly getting thicker and thicker, almost as if someone had got hold of one of those fog-making machines they use in film studios when they're making horror films like The Hound of the Baskervilles or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Suddenly, an ear-piercing scream ran out across the dark, deserted, fog-lined streets. Burke felt a chill run right down the middle of his back. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Beads of sweat ran along his forehead. His hands were wet and clammy. His breathing was now fast and furious, and most of the colour had drained from his face. All was quiet. Then, sad to say, the slightest of squeaky farts blew from his bottom, as if to deliberately ruin what had the makings of a really promising suspense scene. He looked around to see if he could work out where the scream had emanated. He couldn't see anyone. Firstly, he looked up the street, then he looked down the street. Then he tried looking down the street before looking up the street. But whichever way he could it, there was nobody to be seen. Believe me. Just then, another scream rang out, this time louder and more eerie than the first. Then there was total silence. Tranquility itself fell on the dimly lit, lonely street. Burke thought he could make out a dark figure standing in the shop doorway about 10 metres away. The figure looked strangely familiar. About the same height as Burke, 6 feet 1 inch, same build, and the same peaked cap sitting skew-whiff on his pons. As Burke took 3 tentative steps towards it, the figure replicated his actions by also taking 3 steps towards him. He paused, then took 2 more steps, and this time kicked out his right leg and twirled it around like John Cleese in the sketch from The Ministry of Silly Walks. At that same time, the figure copied his movements exactly. Curious, Burke, who then decided to put an end to this charade once and for all, and promptly took 5 bold steps forward and walked straight into the glass-fronted shop door. After peeling his nose from the door, he turned around quickly to see if anyone had noticed his blunder. His attention was soon drawn to a dark, sinister-looking shape running away from him at great speed. The shape appeared to be a man wearing a black top hat, cloak and gloves, and as he gathered speed, his silhouette got smaller and smaller, until he finally disappeared over the horizon. Burke couldn't help being reminded of the scene from Jack the Ripper. You know, the darkness, the fog, the period costume, typical of the gentry of that era, and darkness again. It really was dark. As he continued, he noticed the shape of a young woman slumped up against the stable door at the Tynewood Equestrian Centre. She was wearing a short sequin black dress, long pink coat with matching high heels, and stunk of cheap perfume. She appeared to be dressed like a typical lady of the night, or rather ex-lady of the night, but under closer examination, Burke realised that her throat had been cut. Just as Burke was turning the victim over to have a closer look, a young man came up to explain he'd witnessed the whole incident. "I saw this man came out of nowhere. Seemed to have a piece of wood in his hand, then he put it to her throat and... ah!" "What do you mean, ah? Is this what the victim cried out?" "No, that's what I said just now. I just got cramp in my leg." After Burke had made a note of his name and telephone number, the eyewitness started for home. He was still in a state of shock after his traumatic ordeal. He kept nervously looking all around to see if anyone was following him. He could not hear or see anyone as he turned into Canal Way, but could feel his heart pounding so hard that he thought it would jump right out of his chest. As he passed the cemetery, he paused and considered taking a shortcut through the graveyard, then quickly scorned himself for even thinking of doing something so stupid. Surely everyone knows that in all the best horror films, the victim gets killed walking through the graveyard. So, breathing a sigh of relief, he crossed to the other side of the road, only to be trampled to death by a herd of stampeding elephants appearing in the wrong film.